And welcome back, Bonnie Allen and Stephanie Belveg from the New York State Office of Prevention of Domestic Violence for their second session today. This afternoon's session will build upon the information that was shared this morning by Bonnie and Stephanie. And their title this afternoon is The Intersections of Domestic Violence and Human Trafficking. Welcome, Bonnie and Stephanie.
Thank you very much. We're very excited and happy to be here. So to those of you that attended this morning, thank you all for coming back. I know there was a tech issue, we're going to call it minor, this morning, but we really appreciate you all coming back this afternoon. And we're going to refresh a little bit and really build upon what we talked about this morning. So as mentioned, this is the intersections of domestic violence and human trafficking. I'm going to let Bonnie Allen introduce herself, and then I will introduce myself.
Good afternoon, everyone. We're happy to be back again for round two. I think I mentioned, I don't know how many of you were in the first session or not, so we're just some of it maybe repeat to if you have attended the earlier session. I've been with the Office for the Prevention of Domestic Violence for 10 years. I do a lot of work around the intersections of domestic violence with health, particularly behavioral health, mental health. We've done a lot of work with Department of Health on the intersections of HIV and AIDS and domestic violence, substance use and domestic violence, and really are happy to have the opportunity to talk to you about the intersections of domestic violence and human trafficking today. Prior to coming to OPDV, I did a lot of my work in Nassau and Dutchess County. I worked with victims and their children in both residential and non-residential domestic violence services. I worked with offenders in an offender accountability program for mostly the groups were for male perpetrators of domestic violence. We did have one female offender group, and that was a group that oftentimes people were mandated to, and it was an opportunity for them, well, first of all, so that there were some consequences in place for their abusive behavior, and also to provide them with the opportunities to change their behavior and offer them support and strategies to change their behavior and to accept responsibility for their behavior. I also worked with families in a reentry program for individuals that had been formerly incarcerated and were trying to transition successfully back into the community. I did custody and visitation mediations at a community dispute resolution center and worked for a financial self-sufficiency program to help people become independent of needing temporary or public assistance. And one of the things that I found in each of those other capacities working with families was that oftentimes domestic violence or gender-based violence really interfered with people's ability to transition successfully back into the community, interfered with their ability to effectively use the family court system or criminal justice system, and also interfered with their ability to be financially independent. So we see domestic violence across many different systems and settings, and we're happy to be here today to talk about the intersections with human trafficking and domestic violence.
Thank you, Bonnie. So I don't have a cool slide. We weren't sure if I was going to make it this afternoon, given all of our other Domestic Violence Awareness Month activities that are happening, but I will still introduce myself, and you have my picture here. You take a snapshot. So my name is Stephanie Belvig. I also work for the New York State Office for Prevention of Domestic Violence. I'm the Assistant Director of Professional Education here at OPDV. Prior to my work at OPDV, I have been in many different systems in New York State. I was an advocate for a long time, working specifically with victims and survivors who also had IDD, which is intellectual developmental disability diagnosis, mental health diagnosis, and substance use. Prior to my work there, I was in, like I said, many systems. I worked child welfare system, social services system. I've worked in homeless shelters, domestic violence shelters. I found that no matter what I was doing, no matter where I was, that if I was working with families, I was always going to end up working with people who have or previously had experienced domestic violence, maybe perpetrators, children who grew up in homes where there was domestic violence. So I've always found that if you're working with families, you are going to be working with people who have experienced this. And so I'm very excited to be here this afternoon. I'm excited to do this. I really find this topic very passionate, and I'm excited to kind of bring together that intersection of domestic violence and human trafficking. So with that, let's talk a little bit about what we're going to do this afternoon. And I will stop saying good morning. I realized I said that earlier, but we're in afternoon now. So we've got about 90 minutes here together, a little less than now, about 70 minutes or so, 80 minutes. I don't know math. Anywho, We're really going to give you an overview of gender-based violence, including what is domestic violence and sexual violence. Then we're really going to dive deep into how that intersects with domestic violence, or excuse me, with human trafficking. So really understanding the gender-based violence, domestic violence, sexual violence, and then tying that into that intersection with human trafficking. And we're going to really talk about services and supports available for victims of domestic violence, and really what that overlap looks like when it comes to the work that you're doing, including human trafficking. So before I begin, I always like to acknowledge that this is a very difficult training topic. So thank you very much. In the chat box, the New York State Domestic and Sexual Violence Hotline has been provided. Please note that self-care is paramount. This is a topic that can be very difficult. We know, given the statistics, that there are probably people in this room today who have previously experienced domestic or gender-based violence, sexual violence, or even human trafficking. We also understand that, you know, friends, family members, or even difficult cases. So please take care of yourself. If you need to step away, you need a moment for yourself, please do so. I always say you can't pour from an empty glass, and I really truly mean that. We can't help others without helping ourselves first. So please take care of yourself today and in all the work that you do. Additionally, if you would like to reach out or talk to anyone, the New York State Domestic and Sexual Violence Hotline is available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, available in most languages. This QR code on the screen right here will take you directly to the chat line. Whether you call, text, or chat, whether it's you, a family member, friend of someone who's experiencing gender-based violence, or someone who is experiencing it, they will always be connected to a live advocate. That live advocate is there to help with listening, services, supports, resources, referrals, or emergency safety planning and crisis management. Additionally, the Office of Mental Health, OMH, operates a crisis text line, and that is 741-741, and that is available as well 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So that information is in the chat box, and if anyone would like to take a quick picture of this, I'll give you guys about 10 seconds or so. If you want to, screenshot this, grab your phone, take a picture, scan the QR code. I'll give you guys just a minute, like I said, 10 seconds or so to do that. Okay. So a little bit about OPDV. We are a small but mighty agency, as we always like to say. So we're the only executive or cabinet level state agency in the entire country dedicated to the prevention and awareness of domestic and gender-based violence. And so how do we do that? We do that through many different ways. The first is public policy. We really look to ensure that state officials, whether that's government agencies, county agencies, or any agencies here in New York State, have policies and procedures that are survivor-centered, trauma-informed, and culturally responsive. Additionally, we do education and public awareness. We're here today presenting to all of you. Bonnie and I, we present the Safe and Together training model to child welfare staff throughout the state. And really here at OPDV, we will train on the intersection of any type of gender-based violence and the work that people do. We also do 101 sessions to general population. We also do public awareness campaigns. This month is Domestic Violence Awareness Month. So we've got a lot of really awesome things happening all month. If you're interested, check out our website. We have some really awesome free webinars and trainings all month, and a lot of campaigns happening that are available throughout the state. So take a look at those as well. And then we work with all of the providers in New York State to ensure they have everything that they need to help survivors stay safe and move towards self-sufficiency. And so here at OPDV, a lot of the work that we do is through our three pillars. And so our three pillars are survivor-centered, trauma-informed, and culturally responsive. And so it's really looking at what is survivor-centered. That's giving that self-determination back to that survivor, right? Recognizing that they have the right and the freedom to make decisions about how to live their lives, right? They are the experts in their case. They know what is going to be safest for them. And we want to give that back to them, right? We want to give that decision-making and that self-determination back. And we want to be trauma-informed in all of the work that we do, right? We want to avoid re-traumatizing anybody. So being trauma-informed really shifts from what is wrong with you to what has happened, right? Promoting that compassion and healing. And then we want to be culturally responsive, recognizing that everyone has different intersectionalities. and understanding that those intersectionalities really will impact the services and supports that are available to them, their experiences, their feelings of reaching out. And we're going to talk a lot about intersectionalities in a little bit, so I'm not going to dive too deep into that. So I did get a question in the chat box, and the question was, what does OPDV stand for? And that is Office for the Prevention of Domestic Violence. And so if you look in the chat box, you'll see that both under the titles for Bonnie and myself, you'll see our agency listed there, and that's OPDV. OPDV is just an acronym, as we have so many of them here in New York, for Office for Prevention of Domestic Violence. Thank you for asking that. All right. So you've heard me mention gender-based violence a few times, and so I want to really kind of dive into what is gender-based violence. So gender-based violence is any harmful threat or act that is directed at an individual or a group based on actual or perceived sex, gender, gender identity, sexual orientation, or characteristics. It can encompass physical, sexual, psychological, emotional, economic, and technological or technology abuse or harm. And it can include harassment or coercion. And so we're going to talk about all of this. We're going to kind of dive into what this means. So I want you to think of it like this. It is an act of violence that is being justified by using that gender or sexuality of that victim or survivor. And so when we really think about it, gender-based violence is an umbrella term. It encompasses a lot of different types of violence. And so I don't want you to really just think about, okay, well, focus on all of these. We're really going to dive deep into a couple of them and the intersections with human trafficking. Trafficking is a type of gender-based violence, right? And, you know, when we talk about statistics, you'll realize why it's called gender-based violence, but really recognizing that because it's an umbrella term, I like to think of it like a silly family tree. At the top of the family tree, you have gender-based violence. And then branched out, you have some types of different violence. And then even below that, you'll see more types of violence, right? For example, gender-based violence, you have sexual violence, and then that branches out into different types of violence. And so again, I don't want you to really hyper-focus on these different types. We're going to specifically talk about sexual violence, domestic violence, and the intersections with trafficking today. I want you to remember that, you know, gender-based violence, it disproportionately impacts women and girls. It also disproportionately impacts lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and intersex persons. So again, as we move forward and we're thinking about these different things, please keep that in mind. Okay, so like I said, we're going to focus on these two types of gender-based violence, and then we're going to dive into the intersections with human trafficking. Did I miss anything, Bonnie? Anything you want to add? Okay.
You are rolling along good.
Awesome. Any questions or anything up until now? We love to hear questions. Please feel free to drop them in the Q&A or the chat. As we go forward, we want to be able to answer those questions for you live. So feel free to drop those in there if you do have any. I like the little emojis and reactions. Yay. Okay. So let's first talk about domestic violence. So domestic violence, and I'm going to dive deep into this definition a little bit and then kind of break it down. So domestic violence is a pattern of behavior used by an individual to establish and maintain power and control over their intimate partner. That behavior includes abusive tactics, threats, or actions that may or may not rise to the level of criminal behavior. And the tactics may include physical, emotional, financial, or sexual abuse. And so, like I said, I want to break this down just a little bit. So when I say a pattern of behavior, I don't necessarily mean that it's the exact same thing over and over. Like every Tuesday is physical abuse and every Wednesday is financial abuse, right? When I say pattern, I mean it's any behavior that one person is using to gain and maintain control over the other. That behavior can look different every single day. And what's important to remember is the way to control one person is going to be very different than somebody else. So for example, the way to isolate me is probably very different than the way to isolate Bonnie. And so recognizing that those behaviors are going to look different in every relationship. In the context of this, this definition, we are looking at domestic violence as an intimate partnership, right? It is two people who have social or intimate contact, a dating couple, a couple who's, been married, who's had any intimate relationships, maybe formally married, currently married, has a child in common, right? That's intimate partner. Depending on the system you're working in, it can also expand to be family or household member. And then I want to talk about this may or may not rise to the level of criminal behavior, because oftentimes I say that and people are like, well, wait a second, domestic violence is criminal. And many behaviors associated with domestic violence are absolutely criminal. Strangulation, sexual assault, physical abuse, stalking, those are absolutely criminal behaviors. However, some of the behaviors that are associated with domestic violence may not rise to that level. Reading someone's text messages, undermining their parenting, those don't necessarily rise to the level of criminal behavior. And so it can really include any emotional, financial, sexual, or physical abuse tactics. So I want to the way I like to look at domestic violence is this idea of coercive controlling behavior. Really understanding that coercive control is a systematic attack on another person's freedom, their ability to make decisions, right? So that perpetrator is using any behavior necessary to take away that other person's freedom, to take away their ability to make choices, to take away their fundamental sense of self, their self-determination. And so coercive control is defined as an act or a pattern of acts, threats, humiliation, and intimidation used to harm, punish, or frighten. So I want you to look at it as those specific behaviors to gain control. And so if you came to my Safe and Together training this morning, you would have heard me talk about two brothers named Luke and Ryan. So they grew up in a home where there was domestic violence. And they talk about how there was never any physical abuse and it was just coercive controlling behavior. And it did not make that situation any less dangerous. Unfortunately, they lost their mother and their sister to their father's abusive behaviors through a murder-suicide. And they really talk about how they were overlooked through all of the many different systems because they weren't the kids who were acting out. They didn't get bad grades, right? They were always there. They were always doing well and happy. And so they talk about how coercive control is not necessarily what's done to you. It's what you can't do yourself, and how violence is a subset of control. It's how somebody gets that control. And so I really like that because it helps us really kind of see how domestic violence might look and really understand that it's so much more than just physical abuse, sexual abuse. When we think about things like gaslighting, emotional abuse, isolation, financial abuse, those are all aspects of how a perpetrator may gain control. And what's important to remember is these things don't happen overnight, right? Abusive, behaviors don't start on the first or second date, because if they did, we wouldn't have a second or third date. Recognizing that it happens over time. It's a process, not a singular incident. And understanding that sometimes coercive control can look like love and affection in these relationships. So I'd like to hear from you guys now. Please feel free to use the chat box feature. What are some ways a perpetrator may gain control? What are some tactics of coercive control? What are some behaviors associated with that? We'll give you all a minute to put your answers in there. I see a question. I'm going to go through my answers first, and then we're going to come back to that question. So I'm not ignoring it. I just want to make sure we finish the activity, and then I'll come back to that so that I can ask this question to everybody. So I see the love bombing, right? Love bombing came in quite a few times. We see that, right? This hyper love bombing. And that's actually something we see overlapping when there's domestic violence and human trafficking. And Bonnie's going to dive way deep into that later. But that's something we see. I was telling Bonnie earlier about a human trafficking case that I had where the perpetrator, that's what he did, that love bombing, the buying all the gifts and everything when she was very young, when she was under 18, to the point where, she was like, oh, I got a car, I got diamonds, I got jewelry, right? To lure them in. So very, very good. Finances, holding the finances, putting them all in the perpetrator's name, withholding vehicles. Absolutely, right? If I don't have access to a vehicle, I can't go to the doctor. I can't take the kids anywhere. Gaslighting, yes. So gaslighting is when that perpetrator looks to distort the victim's reality, make them doubt or question their own reality? Absolutely. So we see that a lot. It can even lead to that victim not realizing that they are a victim of any type of gender-based violence. Keeping you from your family, friends, that isolation piece. Monitoring your receipts at stores by checking the time to make sure you were where you say you are. Okay, I see you spent $19.98. Where's my 2 pennies? I gave you a $20 bill. Where's the change? I don't see on here that you got the receipt says potatoes, but I don't see them. Where are they? Not allowing them to have a job or sabotaging their job, absolutely manipulating them. All of these really, really great answers. Thank you. All right, so a question came in. What would have been the best way to find out those boys was in an abusive home? So I'm guessing that's in relation to Luke and Ryan. And so we talk a lot about really assessing for domestic violence and looking for it through this idea of coercive control. And, looking at what else is happening. So they were the kids who never did any extracurricular activities, though. They were the kids who had to be home at a certain time, so they couldn't stay after school, right? And so looking for things beyond just bruises and bones and tired, they weren't up all night because their dad was screaming at their mother. So they weren't tired when they came to school, right? So, I think it's really looking beyond just those stereotypical things that we look for in children and recognizing that children are going to have other impacts. The not being able to socialize, the not being able to play sports, those are other things that we can start to look for to identify that these children might be experiencing something more at home through isolation. Maybe they don't have access to technology. Maybe they don't have access to winter clothes. Maybe they don't have access to new things like new notebooks or pens or pencils, or, they're wearing very dirty, ratty, lots of holes in their clothes that are not supposed to be there, because my kid wears clothes that are just holes. I'm like, why bother? But really, really looking for those things as well. So that was a really great question. Thank you. Bonnie, anything you want to add?
No, I just would agree that it is a good question. And even if, right, all of the examples that Stephanie gave you of things to pay attention and look to, those are not things that are criminal behavior, right? So it may not be that you're even identifying it so that you can call
Very
Child
good. Thank
Protective
you.
Services or reach out, because there's no crime being committed. Those children may not have even understood, right, that they were victims of domestic violence. They just thought they had strict parents. And so I think if you can pay attention to all those things that Stephanie just said, and if you start to get a sense that maybe these kids have less freedoms, less ability to make choices, don't have all of their basic needs being met, it's more about paying attention to that. And as an adult, trying to establish a positive relationship with that child so that they have that connection. And if they do feel comfortable, or if they do think something's off, or they're unhappy, or they don't have something they need, then maybe they're comfortable to engage and tell that person. But it's one of those things where even if you do know that, at that point, there's not, other than trying to support that child, there's really not a lot that you can do.
Absolutely. Thank you, Bonnie. And something came in the chat that ties right into that, and that's using the children's as a mean to control. And I didn't want to make sure I missed that one, because absolutely, perpetrators will use children as a way to control that victim. They'll even use the different systems. Like, if you leave, I'm going to call CPS or ACS on you. I'm going to call the police. I'm going to say you're kidnapping these children, or making it so the children want to live with that perpetrator full time because that perpetrator buys them iPads and new sneakers, and the survivor is in a shelter maybe, right? And really, or just saying, if you don't do X, Y, and Z, I'm going to harm these children, or they're not going to get what they need, and using those kids. So thank you. That was another great one. When we think about statistics, everyone always jokes, I love statistics. I kind of keep a little bank of statistics here in my head sometimes. But what I think is really important is that statistics paint a picture for us. They really help us understand the prevalence of the things that are happening and how that might overlap with the work that we do. So we know that 1 in 4 women and 1 in 10 men have experienced sexual violence, physical violence, or stalking by an intimate partner. And so, even further into that, we know that 54% of transgender and non-binary people experience domestic violence in their lifetime. And that leads me to this concept of intersectionality. So intersectionality is how we experience life. It's our foundational identity or our social category that very unfortunately can lead to things like discrimination and oppression within society. And perpetrators will use those intersectionalities as a way to gain and maintain power and control. And not just in domestic violence, right? These can overlap with human trafficking, sexual violence. It can be a way to make me feel like if I call the systems, I'm going to get deported because I'm not a citizen. Or, right, I'm going to lose my children because I'm not a citizen, or I don't speak English, so I don't understand. So intersectionalities are those foundational identities: race, ethnicity, gender identity, sexual orientation, being a member of the LGBTQIA plus community, culture, nationality, age, ability, socioeconomic status in the community. And I want to be clear, none of these intersectionalities are bad, right? But unfortunately, like I said, sometimes they can lead to things like discrimination or oppression within society. And perpetrators can use that as a way to isolate that victim, to further that coercive control and make the victim even fear those very services that are there to help. So this is a term that was coined by a woman named Kimberly Crenshaw. And I'm going to quote Kimberly Crenshaw because I just love the way that she talks about intersectionalities. So she says, Black women are not discriminated against just as Black women or as women. They are discriminated against as Black women. And intersectionality gives us a term so that we can identify it and therefore understand it. And when we really truly think about it in the context of gender-based violence, we can see how perpetrators might use someone's intersectionality as a way to control them. For example, immigration status, right? I just gave that a little bit of an example, but hiding their documentation, hiding their paperwork so that they can't go anywhere or do anything, right? If I'm a victim of trafficking or domestic violence and my trafficker or perpetrator has my documentation, how am I going to go anywhere? Where am I going to go, right? I can't, if I go to the police, I don't have anything to show them. If I go to a different system, I don't have anything to show them. Threatening to have me deported or call ICE, right? That's another way. Tie in language. If I don't speak English, I may not know what's available to me or the services and supports. Or maybe I'm a member of the LGBTQIA plus community and my perpetrator uses that and says, I'm going to out you. I'm going to send these pictures to your family, your friends, your coworkers. And maybe I haven't told them yet. Maybe they use my religion and say, you have to obey, or you can't divorce, or you can't leave me because it's in this, or culture. If you leave, you'll be shunned. Nobody will talk to you. So again, using those different intersectionalities to further that coercive control and isolate that survivor. Excuse me. And when we look at intersectionalities, we know that, unfortunately, 80% of Indigenous women, 40% of Black women, and 34% of Latina women will experience domestic violence at some point in their lifetime. And so really think about these numbers and think about all of the people that you have ever worked with. And think about, I'm not saying that like every fourth person is someone who's experienced domestic violence, but again, think about those numbers and what that means in the context of your work. So why is that? I'm guessing that's in terms to intersectionality. So the reason that perpetrators can use those things that makes it makes the victim more vulnerable. The unfortunate reality is that perpetrators will use the victim's vulnerabilities, whether that's mental health and substance use, or it's their identity, right? Because unfortunately, some identities, while they're not bad, our identities are never bad. Unfortunately, some of these identities do lead to things like discrimination and oppression within society, right? For example, everything's in English. If I don't speak English or even the top 12 language, that might make it more difficult for me to access services, to know what's available to me, to access a translator or some kind of services. And perpetrators can say, well, oh, okay, I'll be your translator, and then lie about everything, right? So they can use those different identities to control and further isolate that victim. Do you want to add anything? I saw you nodding.
Well, it's like if that community, right, maybe has had poor experiences with certain systems in the past, that community may not reach out for services and support from law enforcement. A person of color or a person in an indigenous community who's been oppressed before or treated badly by law enforcement or the court system or hasn't had fair access to those systems, that victim may be less likely to call and reach out for help because they don't want to expose their partner to that system and what they may see as unjust or that hasn't treated them fairly in the past. And as Stephanie would said, that survivor may also not feel that they're going to be believed because maybe their community or people in their community have been disrespected before. Perpetrators will use that. They will say, no one will believe you. How could you bring that system into our community, right? You're going to make us look bad.
You saw what happened on the TV. You want that to happen to me, our kids? You want our kids to see that? Sorry, that just popped in my head. I had to say it. But absolutely. So that's a good question. Thank you so much for asking it. And so that leads us to sexual violence. So this is the next piece of gender-based violence that I want to talk about. And we're going to kind of dive right into it. So just like gender-based violence, sexual violence is an umbrella term. And it really encompasses many different types of violence. So sexual violence includes sexual acts or activities that happen without consent. This may include rape, sexual assault, or sexual abuse. Sexual violence includes different types of unwanted physical contact, including rape, molestation, groping, sexual abuse by an intimate partner, child sexual abuse, and it may or may not rise to the level of criminality. So I'm going to, just like before, break this definition down a little bit. So first I want to talk about may or may not rise to the level of criminality. Not everything associated with sexual violence may rise to that level. For example, a stranger catcalling someone down the street and then running, you know what I mean? Or, unfortunately, sometimes laws don't update as fast as perpetrators' behaviors do. So very recently, a couple years now, revenge pornography laws came into place. We had that because we saw what was happening, right? With the text messages and the pictures and everything being sent. But prior to, that law, there wasn't a law in place. And so sometimes that's what we see happening, right? That those perpetrators' behaviors are escalating faster than the laws can. And so I want to define consent because we cannot talk about any type of sexual violence without talking about consent. So consent is freely formed, enthusiastic permission for what someone is okay with in relation to their body. Consent can be taken back at any time. It is not based on relationship status or consent given in the past. Consent cannot be given if someone is incapacitated, underage, sleeping, or physically helpless. And consent cannot be given if they are physically forced, manipulated, guilted, or coerced into that activity. So it's freely given, fully informed, enthusiastic permission for what someone is okay with. So a fun acronym that I think it was Planned Parenthood came up with is FRIES. So if you ever forget, right, FRIES here, you'll see that's the first letter of each one of these, right? So you can remember what consent is. We know that sexual violence is one of the most underreported crimes. And yet we also know that on average, 24 people per minute are victims of rape, physical violence, or stalking by an intimate partner. And that we know that 1 in 5 women and 1 in 13 men have experienced contact sexual violence by a partner. And we know that transgender people are 4 times more likely to experience violent victimization, including rape and sexual assault. And again, this ties right back to intersectionalities, right? Using someone's vulnerabilities, right? And then, using those intersectionalities as a way to make them feel like they can't disclose and they can't talk about it. And so, like I mentioned, sexual violence is an umbrella term. And so I want to talk about a few different types of sexual violence. And so the first one is sexual assault. Sexual assault is the unwanted sexual contact through physical force, threats, guilt, manipulation, or coercion with the goal of establishing power and control. So just like domestic violence, it is all about power and control. It is not about sex. It is about gaining and maintaining that power and control. I had a case where the perpetrator used to leave a gun on the nightstand anytime they wanted sex. The woman I was working with said, I said no once. He picked that gun up, pointed it at my head and said, "Are you sure that's your final answer?" She said, from that moment on, I knew if that gun was on the nightstand, I knew what my answer had to be. Even if I didn't want to, I had to. That was force. That was manipulation, right? Because she was forced into it, even if she didn't want to. So now, rape is a type of sexual assault, but I want to, again, kind of dive a little bit deeper into it. So, when we really think about rape, it's often different than what most people define it as and kind of how the law looks at it. So, New York State in 2024 actually amended and modernized the laws around rape. And so survivors are protected from certain crimes, including more. So this kind of dives deep into that rape is rape bill. And I'm not going to talk too much about that, but just that it's kind of expanded that definition. And really, so what that means is it took away the fact that rape had to be penetration through vaginal sexual contact, oral contact, or anal contact. So, the previous one excluded a lot of things, and so it's expanded upon that. So historically, rape was defined as actual or attempted penetration of the vagina, anus, or mouth without consent. And it's taken away that penetration piece so that doesn't have to be a actual requirement. And then the last piece is sexual harassment. And that is the unwanted verbal or physical sexual advances, explicit statements, or discriminatory remarks because of the victim's sex. So that can be brushing up against someone inappropriately, right? Rubbing up against them, making comments about their body, the clothes they're wearing. It could also be catcalling or whistling down the street to somebody. It can be sending them unwanted videos or pictures that are sexual in nature. Oftentimes I say sexual harassment and people automatically think, oh, that's what happens in the workplace. And yes, it absolutely can. Any type of sexual violence can happen in the workplace, and so can sexual harassment. However, it can also happen by an intimate partner, a family member, a friend, or an acquaintance. In fact, we know that all types of sexual violence, while they can happen by strangers and acquaintances, more often that victim knows that perpetrator. 8 out of 10 rapes are committed by somebody that victim knows. And we know that the same is true for sexual harassment, that most sexual harassment cases are by somebody that victim knows. And again, that can even be an intimate partner or a family member or household member. Any questions or anything on that?
Okay, so we're going to move now and talk about human trafficking. And as Stephanie said earlier, right, human trafficking can be a form of intimate partner or domestic violence. And that's where we're going to really start to look at now for our rest of our time together, all of the intersections and the similarities. And when I was putting this presentation together, kind of off the top of my head, I was like, oh, this is the same, this is the same. When I actually started working on the presentation, there are so many commonalities and similarities. And so we're going to go through those and talk about these. Human trafficking is another form of gender-based violence, and it does have that significant overlap with domestic and sexual violence. It's defined as the use of fraud, force, coercion to compel an individual to labor or commercial sex. I think a lot of times we think about human trafficking, we tend to think about that sex trafficking, but labor trafficking is also an important piece of that. Commercial sex is defined as the exchange of a sex act for money or anything of value. Trafficking is, well, there's several definitions. That's the main one I want to work with, but I also think it's important to talk about that it is the recruitment, harboring, provision, receipt, transportation, or obtaining of individuals by using force, threats, coercion, fraud, or using systems of indebtedness or debt, bondage for purposes of sexual or other forms of economic exploitation. So it can be that economic exploitation and the exploitation of sex. There's also domestic minor sex trafficking, and that's when we're talking about minors, recruiting, enticing, harboring, transporting, providing, or obtaining a minor for the purpose of sexual exploitation, right? Prostitution, survival sex, pornography sex, tourism, performed in sexual venues, early marriage, mail order brides, all of those can be tied to human trafficking. And while the phrase human trafficking has for many people, we tend to think of kidnapped young people that are literally physically constrained. It's actually, and we oftentimes associate it with people from other countries. We want to be very, very clear that trafficking, human trafficking, both sex and labor trafficking is happening in our own backyards. There are many of our students that are experiencing trafficking, going to school every day and being trafficked in the evenings or you know, after school or pulled from school for the purposes of either labor or sex trafficking. And oftentimes the trafficker is the intimate partner of the victim that's being trafficked. I just want to take a minute and talk about the Safe Harbor Act for exploited children. One of the things that this did was it really shifted the language that we use and made it explicitly clear that sexually exploited children are victims, not criminals. For many, many years, we saw anyone that was engaged in any type of what we would refer to as prostitution or sex work. We would see that individual as a criminal, even if that person was a young person who did not have the ability to consent to sexual activity. So in 2008, so that with the language changed, right? We moved from a criminal, right, to a victim. We moved from using child prostitute to a victim. We moved from looking at them as promiscuous youth to seeing them as victims. So that's really important, right? How we talk about something really is going to change how we respond to it. In 2008, legislation in New York State recognized that commercially sexually exploited children are victims, not criminals. And the Safe Harbor for Exploited Children Act provided unprecedented legal protections and diversion opportunities for youth who previously experienced victim blaming and prosecution, right? So when we start to recognize them as victims and not criminals, then we can provide a different response, right? We can provide opportunities for support and healing and safety and resources as opposed to punishment. By doing this, this act helps to prevent entry into juvenile justice system, or for people who are already in the juvenile justice system as a result of being trafficked, right? It can create a pathway out of that system. And again, we want to talk here about intersectionalities. Sorry, we're managing different slides here. Intersections of domestic violence and trafficking. These are complicated cases. The intersections are often very complex. They're very interwoven and intertwined. They're compelling when you start to think about this. And as we go through all of the similarities and all of the places where there are intersections, it will start to seem quite obvious as we're starting to talk about them. Yet oftentimes we see domestic violence or intimate partner violence as completely separate and apart from trafficking, where really, like I said, they are often interwoven in ways that are very complex. And the biggest thing that they have in common is that they are both rooted in that desire for power and control. And that coercive control that Stephanie was talking about earlier is present in both trafficking and in domestic violence. And oftentimes the overlap, they are literally right on top of each other. They are one and the same in certain circumstances and in certain situations. So what the overlap and what we see in both of these, both in trafficking and in domestic violence, both are trauma-based, right? The perpetrator's behaviors and tactics are often the same or very similar in both human trafficking and in domestic violence. The experience of the victim, particularly that experience of being trapped, helpless, and powerless, are very similar. There are many connections both in trafficking and domestic violence in connection to family violence. For those of you who attended our session earlier on Safe and Together, we talk about those multiple pathways to harm, right? And all of the ways that children may become harmed. One of the ways that children may become harmed when they're living with or experiencing domestic violence is they may then become more vulnerable to being trafficked or even to becoming traffickers. Oftentimes, when we're looking particularly at youth, there is a lot of involvement for youth that are being trafficked or who are living in homes where there is domestic violence. There is a lot of involvement in the juvenile justice system, the child welfare system, and our foster care system. So a lot of overlap there. The language that we use is very similar. We're talking about victims and survivors and perpetrators and offenders. There are particularly destructive patterns and dynamics in both. And again, mostly those are tied to that dynamic of coercive controlling violence. Both are criminal behavior, although as Stephanie mentioned, not all forms of domestic violence are actually crimes. But human trafficking, whether it's labor or sex trafficking, particularly when we're talking about children, is criminal behavior. And the other thing, when I again started really looking into this and thinking about it, that I came to understand is that the services that victims of trafficking and victims of intimate partner violence need and the response they need from the systems are often very similar, right? So these are a lot of the places where we really tend to see that overlap. So we talked a little bit earlier about kind of the different ways that children come to be harmed when there is domestic violence present. And so I just want to take a minute and talk about the adverse childhood experiences and trauma, because both trafficking and domestic violence have that trauma underlay, right? How many of you are familiar with or have heard of the adverse childhood experiences study? And just respond in the chat box. I just want to get a sense of how deep of a dive I want to do. Okay, so I'm seeing that. All right, so I'm seeing people come in. Some I have not. It used to be when I would ask that question 5 years ago, almost no one heard of adverse childhood experiences, and so I'm always happy now when I see people in the audience that are familiar with it. It was a study done by Kaiser Permanente, and they identified 10 adverse childhood experiences. And so those experiences are the ones that we see kind of above the ground there, right? So it's the original ones were having a parent that has a mental health issue, a substance use issue, or had been incarcerated, growing up in a home where there was domestic violence, or a parent had substance use issues, where there was child abuse, or neglect, or child sexual violence. So it identified those those early adverse experiences. Oftentimes, if domestic violence is an adverse childhood experience, it is likely that you may also have a parent that was incarcerated or has a substance use issue, right? You may have also experienced homelessness. You may have a survivor that has depression, right? Or anxiety or mental health issues. So where there's domestic violence, we tend to have those higher adverse childhood experiences. And oftentimes when you have that impacts the children's, as that child is growing up, it impacts how their brain is developed. It impacts the decisions and choices they make. So oftentimes children with high adverse childhood experiences are more likely to engage in risk-taking behavior, right? So we see sometimes substance use, alcohol abuse, risky sexual behavior. We see a connection to runaway and homelessness youth. And then we are not a far jump there, right? From where we have kids that are depressed, anxious, using substances, engaging in risk-taking behavior, running away from a home that does not feel safe and comfortable. Now we are right up against where they are especially vulnerable to trafficking, right? Sex trafficking and labor trafficking. The other thing that's important to recognize about the adverse childhood experience study is that oftentimes those are the 10 that were studied, and they were studied by Kaiser Permanente for many years and are linked to these long-term health outcomes. But in addition to those early ones that were identified, those initial 10, we know that there is so many other adverse childhood experiences. And so that often children are also experiencing poverty, discrimination, gang violence, community violence, lack of opportunity, poor housing or unstable housing, and they're living with violence also not only within their family, but with outside of their family, right? And so victims, children who grow up in homes where there's domestic violence and children who are trafficked, oftentimes have those high early trauma experiences. So make sure I missed teen pregnancy and parenting. Oftentimes, right, children with those high ACE scores are more likely to end up in our juvenile justice system, in our foster care system, right? And then we know now that those are connections to human trafficking, vulnerability for human trafficking. So when we start to really pull apart teen dating violence, right, we know that children who grow up in homes where there's domestic violence are more often going to find themselves in unhealthy or abusive relationships, either or victims as perpetrators. Again, then it's not a far jump to the trafficking piece of it. So, thinking about who are the perpetrators of trafficking, and so we think about pimps, right? We think about parents or other family members. I did a lot of work in a county jail, and that is where I did a women's trauma group for survivors of trauma. And many of those women had engaged in sex work. And initially that work started because a parent or family member was trafficking them, either to get drugs or substances or whatever it was. They were exploiting the children, their own children, in their own homes, and victims that became victims of trafficking. So parents or other family members are often perpetrators of trafficking. Gangs, crime syndicates, drug users and dealers, and casino workers and intimate partners. And again, when you start to hear and look at stories, and again, I watched a lot of videos on the Polaris website. They have a lot of great videos, real short clips, particularly about the intersections of love and trafficking and intimate partner abuse and violence, right? And so there is a lot of overlap between who are perpetrators and intimate partners of victims, and parents of victims are a big piece of what we're talking about and looking about here.
Question came in, it says, why casino workers? So do you got that? You want me to?
You can if you want.
Sure. I think it's like anything else when you look at some of these too. If you think about the amount of people that go in and out of casinos, right? All of the different, you have someplace like Vegas or Atlantic City where people from all over the world coming in and out. There's constantly people with cash, people winning, right? So it's an easy place where people really aren't looking for that. They're looking for things like gambling, right? They're looking for who's counting cards or who's got fake dice. So it's kind of one of those places where it might fly under the radar. It might not be noticed, but you'll also see that it's just kind of a place where there's a lot of cash flow, a lot of people from all over the world. People are not saying, oh, I see this person here every night, different faces all the time going in and out. And so I think that that's a big piece of it. Did you want to add anything?
No, I was just going to say too, and again, obviously all casinos are different. We can't talk for all people in casinos, right? But there may also be more of that connection to drug users and dealers in that environment, to crime syndicates in that environment. So I think there just may be there are places where we may see more of that, or people may be at more risk. And so when we look at the overlap between who are the traffickers, let's see, I just want to make sure I'm not missing anything. Strip clubs, absolutely. I would agree that is 100% another place. So yes, thank you for that. And I see a previous comment too about there is a number of boys dealing with depression and suicide. Yeah, and so far I haven't talked about, right, when we're talking about victims of trafficking, we know that oftentimes that is women and female victims. We also know that men and boys are also being trafficked, right? And so I want to be very clear about that. We know that men can also be victims of domestic violence, right? Women are more likely to be victims of domestic violence. In trafficking, I think that men and particularly young boys, and we're starting to hear more and more about that, and transgender youth is, again, I think a population that's very vulnerable to trafficking. Rebecca is a survivor who shares her story about her trafficking experience in Vegas with her boyfriend. So thank you, Katie, right? That's a great example. Thank you for that. Right. And so oftentimes traffickers and intimate partners, right, there's that overlap there. And also what they do is very similar, right? So traffickers and domestic violence offenders are engaging in the same behavior. They're coercing their victims. They're controlling their victims. They're forcing their victims. They're using tactics of abuse and coercive control. They're cajoling, enticing, entrapping, and manipulating. Right. So these are the tactics that both human traffickers and domestic violence offenders are using. And oftentimes they are extremely skilled at using these tactics. The other thing that I want to say is that they oftentimes tap into the low self-esteem of their victims, which may be caused by previous, right, abuse. Right. So you may have people that grew up in a home where there was domestic violence. They may have low self-esteem as a result of that. They may also have been abused by their parent or the intimate parent of one of their partners. Right. And so oftentimes perpetrators will tap into that low self-esteem, use that survivor's history or of victimization either in intimate personal relationships or in trafficking situations, or again, remember there's that overlap. And so oftentimes those perpetrators will use that previous victimization and the impact of that previous victimization as a way to engage that person and force that person into trafficking. Oftentimes perpetrators have a sense, domestic violence perpetrators have a sense of entitlement, as do traffickers, that they are entitled to abuse and control and coerce in this way. Oftentimes perpetrators of domestic violence and perpetrators of trafficking, right, do have that sense of entitlement and that they are entitled to do this. And oftentimes they see their victim not even as a human being, but as a resource to them that they have, that they are entitled to control and manipulate. So both use tactics of coercive control. And so again, we just want to look at what these tactics of coercive control are, right? And so this is how they do it. They use it by using physical and sexual violence, physical and mental isolation. They restrict their monitoring and their movement. They use threats of harm. If I threaten to harm you, even if I've never actually physically or sexually harmed you, that making that threat, if you've seen me do that to other people, if you know I'm capable of that, that carries a lot of weight. Degradation, shame, again, tapping into, if I have sex trafficked you once or physically abused you once or had you sleep with my friends one time, I will then use the fact that I got you to do that once to treat you as less than, and I will tap into the shame that you feel, right, to make you feel worse. We talked earlier about controlling, particularly if someone is in this country, maybe illegally, right? Maybe they don't have the documents, or maybe they're here legally, but that perpetrator is controlling all of the documents and all of the financial resources. Very, very powerful way to get someone to do something or engage in something. Perpetrators will also weaponize systems. That system will not serve you well. No one will believe you. They also use a lot of reproductive coercion. There was one case that I read about where the perpetrators pretended to be in love with their victims, purposely raped or got that victim pregnant, did not allow that victim to not have to make decisions about that pregnancy and whether or not to carry that pregnancy to term, and then threatened to use the children also as in their sex trafficking practice, right? Very, very powerful tactics when you're using reproductive coercion and then children. One case that I read about, the threat that the perpetrator did was to reveal to the children all of the things that survivor had done. Show them like that, your mother, right, is all of these horrible things and has engaged in all of these horrible acts, and threatening to tell the children that was a very, very powerful tactic that kept that survivor doing the things that they were being required to do because they didn't want their children to know, or they didn't want their children to be trafficked. So very, very powerful tactics. And again, tactics that both traffickers and intimate partners are using. And oftentimes they, again, are one and the same. We talk about victims and survivors. It's really important to recognize, right, that anybody can be a victim or survivor of domestic violence or trafficking, right? And that also includes members of the LGBTQ community, boys, particularly boys. Oftentimes, male survivors are unidentified or underserved in terms of getting the services that are available to any, particularly youth that are victims of trafficking. And so there's a lot of similarities between the victims as well. And so I want to kind of go through what victims are. And I really want to start by talking, we tend to, I think of victims as weak, as criminal, as incompetent, as powerless. And so I felt it was really important to acknowledge that victims are resilient. They're incredibly creative. They are problem solvers. They are strong. They are survivors. And oftentimes they are able to use their lived experiences, whether it's as a victim of domestic violence or trafficking or both, to educate and help others. And so I really want to acknowledge the strength of both domestic violence victims and trafficking victims. The experiences that they've had, when you read about them and you understand the lack of control and power that they had, and yet somehow they survived, they escaped, they were creative, they saved others, right? And so I think it's really important to acknowledge victims of both of those things are incredibly strong, and not to see them as weak and powerless. We know that oftentimes victims of both human trafficking and domestic violence or intimate partner violence have similar experiences, right? They experience victim blaming, right? We hold both victims, we'll say all the time, why didn't they just leave, right? We say that about people that are being trafficked. We say that about people who are in intimate partner relationships. And so we hear a lot of victim blaming in both of those populations, right? A lot of not understanding how trapped they are and how limited their ability to make decisions and choices is, and how oftentimes for both victims of trafficking and domestic violence, that idea of just leaving is oftentimes the most risky or dangerous thing that they can do. It is the thing that is going to put them at risk of lethality and at the most, and that will escalate the violence and abuse that's happening to them. They oftentimes experience criminalization. Oftentimes we know that domestic violence victims are often, they fight back, right, as a way to protect themselves or their children, as a way of self-defense. And then in that acting out aggressively to protect themselves, oftentimes they are labeled as the perpetrator of domestic violence or abuse, right? So we see criminalization there. And certainly we see with people that are engaged in sex work, adults, and obviously children, where we've really done with the Safe Harbor Act, moved really away from moving that, but hopefully even with adult victims. We know that many adult victims of trafficking were introduced to the trafficking as youth, as children, and that, or as an intimate partner, right? And they really didn't have that choice. And so they are also victims, but oftentimes their behavior is criminalized, and they may even spend time incarcerated or in the justice system or juvenile justice system because they were forced to engage in these behaviors. They experience significant fear, distrust of their partner, distrust of other adults that may be in their lives, distrust of systems, right? They may not trust going to the system, or that the systems will help them or believe them or see them as sympathetic in any way. Both victims of domestic violence and trafficking experience significant health impacts that oftentimes last over the course of the lifetime and are significant, and maybe even early death. They often are pressured to comply with law enforcement, even when that does not feel safe for them to do or in their best interest to do, right? We want survivors, when we have a domestic violence case, we want them to get on the stand and talk about the abuse they've experienced. We want trafficking victims to do the same, so that pressure to do that sometimes can even be another form of systemic abuse. Polyvictimization, we know that victims of both of those things often have been victimized throughout their lives. They may have experienced sexual abuse as a child, physical abuse as a child, and so oftentimes that sets them up to be vulnerable as adolescents and then vulnerable as adults. And again, that's true for both of those populations. And oftentimes they have both experienced harm caused by someone close to them. Right? Anytime anyone is being abused, that is horrific and awful. But what we know is that when someone experiences trauma at the hands of someone that's supposed to love them or care for them, right, that the damage is oftentimes worse, because that person that we're supposed to trust, that person that's supposed to take care of us and love us, is the person that's causing harm to us, right? And oftentimes victims of both of that is what they're experiencing. Right, oftentimes victims are forced into criminal behavior, sexual behavior, engaging in unsafe sex. They're oftentimes forced into pregnancy or terminating a pregnancy. Again, not anything to do with what they want or need, but what that trafficker or that partner wants. Oftentimes they are forced into or coerced into using substances, into poverty, and into homelessness, right? And so again, that force, that coercion into all kinds of these things. And then once you're involved in all of these things, right, the impact of that puts you deeper into difficult and harsh circumstances. Victims oftentimes refuse to engage with systems, may refuse to leave their trafficker. They may not self-identify or recognize themselves as a victim. They may feel unsafe to disclose that they're experiencing abuse. They may not be aware of the resources and remedies that are available to them, particularly in New York State, but there's also many federal protections for victims of domestic violence and trafficking that they may not be aware of. They may not be able to leave their perpetrator, right? Whether it's their intimate partner or their trafficker, or that person is both. They may also be involved with multiple systems and be fleeing violent family or social situations, right? And so again, we may see transgender youth that are running away from home. We may see kids that are growing up in homes where there's domestic violence, that they feel like they need to get out of that home, and then that makes them vulnerable to trafficking and to unhealthy abusive relationships in general. Victims often have the same needs, right? So trafficking and domestic violence victims need emergency shelter. They need stable, consistent, long-term housing. They need legal assistance, and they need advocacy, right? So again, we see that commonality in terms of what they experience, but also in terms of what their needs are. I want to take a minute and talk about teen sex trafficking and labor trafficking. Again, this is a problem that our youth and our minors are experiencing and that they're exposed to. We know that there's a high percentage of youth that have been trafficked, and that it's not just women and girls. Non-binary youth represent about 15% of trafficking victims, and traffickers exploit those vulnerabilities. And just the mere fact of being a child or being a minor is a vulnerability. And the thing that we also want to remember is that sex trafficking in our youth is very rarely the first thing that's been difficult or gone wrong in that child's life, right? They often have grown up in homes where they've experienced abuse or violence or been victims of sexual violence. And so oftentimes the trafficking is a final, not maybe a final, but another place where they are experiencing abuse after they have been exposed to other types of abuse and violence or unsafe circumstances and situations. So again, we see children that are particularly vulnerable, our children that are in our foster care system. Children of color in the United States are about 4 times more likely to be trafficked than white children. Runaway and homeless youth are a big risk factor. Youth that are involved in the juvenile justice system, and youth that have had, complex trauma histories are all particularly vulnerable to trafficking. And we can learn a lot from case studies. And again, when I started doing my research and really doing a dive into this, there's so many places and so many cases where you can really learn about and understand what victims are experiencing. And so I want to just look at quickly a few of the things that kind of come to mind or that showed up that, try to kind of categorize them. So one of the places where we see the intersection is that the intimate partner forces their partner into forced labor or prostitution. So one case that I read about, there was an applicant for a T visa who alleged that her husband had forced her into prostitution and then threatened to tell her children if she didn't engage in forced commercial sex. It's not uncommon in federal trafficking cases and federal prosecutions that the trafficker is the husband, boyfriend, or romantic partner of the victim. The most common domestic violence human trafficking scenario is forced prostitution or forced labor as a factor of their intimate relationship. And also it's important to recognize that forced non-commercial sex may qualify as involuntary servitude. And so it's really the forced wife, mother of a child. We had one perpetrator that forced the wife and mother of their child into the commercial sex and also had multiple other victims as well. And so there's so many cases that are human trafficking cases that began with domestic violence, or that the trafficking came out of that intimate partner relationship. Sometimes we see that the marriage or intimate relationship was fraud from the beginning. So what the traffickers do is they engage with this person that is going to be their victim, right? That they see that is the person that ultimately they're going to traffic. The way that they entrap that survivor is by creating a dating relationship, telling them that they love them, that they want to marry them, that they want to have children with them. And the entire relationship or the pretense of a relationship is really only to get that person to be a victim of trafficking, that person that they will use for trafficking. There was a case in Mexico where the traffickers recruited women and girls by pretending to fall in love with them. And oftentimes in the United States, the boyfriends, husbands, and romantic partners, they kind of that love bombing that they were talking about, right? Create this wonderful, perfect relationship, and then use that relationship to get that person to engage in trafficking. Another case example that I talked to someone that does a lot of human trafficking work and domestic violence work. They said that a lot of times what happens is immigrants come to our country, and then their intimate partner or traffickers makes them engage in trafficking as a way to pay back the coyotes that brought them into this country, right? So it's servitude. You're paying back your debt for getting in here comfortably. So you owe me, you have to do this so that I can pay off the people that brought you to this country. Constantly using false promises of romantic relationships, of a healthy marriage, of a house, of a home, of children, as a way to get that person to engage in trafficking behaviors. We had one victim's legal guardian. There was one case that I read about where the victim legal guardian secretly filmed her having sex with another man, claimed he was married to the victim, and then was using those videotapes for child pornography and sex trafficking. The cases are oftentimes very complicated and complex and involve multiple people and multiple players. Oftentimes a marriage that is an actual real marriage where the intent was not immediate, was the intent of the relationship or the marriage was not to go into human trafficking, but that marriage that was that was not the intent of the marriage devolves into human trafficking, right? So you have a relationship that is real, but then maybe there's substance use or financial abuse, and that perpetrator then convinces their partner for temporarily, I need you to do this to get us out of this circumstance or out of this situation. And then that devolves into the relationship really being only about the trafficking and not about the intimate marriage or relationship that was there from the beginning. So victims are often lured into relationships and then exploited. Victims are oftentimes intentionally impregnated, and then the children are held as hostages and trafficked as well. So again, we see another overlap there between reproductive coercion and maybe an intimate partner relationship, and then using those children as victims of trafficking. I'm trying to keep an eye on our time here because I want to make sure we get through everything. So I think that it seems in so many ways, as I said earlier, the intersections are complex, but when we start to think about it in all of the ways that we just did, it starts to be very obvious, right? That underlying power and control dynamic, that underlying tactic of coercive control is the thing that makes, and the early trauma experiences, right, that create all of these intersections between domestic violence and trafficking. And so there are some differences between the two, but I think oftentimes we conflate those differences and we see them as very different. But I think that the differences between trafficking and domestic violence are very nuanced. And so there may be more of an organized network, right? When you're talking about human trafficking, I think that public perception of domestic violence and trafficking can be very different. One seems not, I think people tend to think of the domestic violence maybe as not as bad as human trafficking. And so I think the public perception is different, although the dynamics are so similar and there are so many commonalities. I think women are more likely to be victims of intimate partner violence than men, but that's, again, we know that men can also be victims of intimate partner violence. I think in the trafficking, we tend to see both male and female victims of domestic violence in more proportion. I think when we're talking about age, when we're talking about domestic violence, we know very, very young children can be in dating relationships and may be experiencing domestic violence. And we know very young children can be being trafficked. But I think in intimate partner violence, we tend to focus more on adult victims. And we sometimes unfortunately miss those very young victims of intimate partner or dating violence. I think the responses also need to be similar in both of these, right? The response needs to include trauma-informed services, survivor-centered responses, culturally responsive. Those three pillars that we have at OPDV are so important for both victims of trafficking and victims of domestic violence. They need housing and shelter. They need legal remedies. We need in both responses cross-system collaboration, a multidisciplinary approach. We can use risk and lethality assessments as responses for both issues and problems. Safety planning is critical for both victims of human trafficking and victims of domestic violence, and advocacy and support, right? So the responses need to be similar, and there's a lot of overlap between the responses. Right, when we're talking about working with victims of trafficking, the same approach that we use with survivors of domestic violence are beneficial to survivors of human trafficking. We want to empower them. We want to give them choices, allow them to make choices, right? Because their ability to make decisions and choices has been removed from them. We want to respect their decision. We want to offer voluntary services. We want to be non-judgmental, culturally responsive, non-victim blaming. We want to do everything we can to avoid re-traumatization, restore what was taken for them, and to promote resiliency and healing. When we can, we want to really create domestic violence and human trafficking partnerships, right? So that we have relationships before, so we can develop relationships prior to when we have to make that referral. We want domestic violence service providers to attend human trafficking coalition meetings. We want people who are providing human trafficking services to be connected to domestic violence coalition meetings. Multidisciplinary teams should include people that are doing human trafficking work and domestic violence work. We want law enforcement at the table. We want Department of Labor. I had a conversation with someone that's doing this work that talked about how instrumental Department of Labor can be in terms of providing financial reimbursement when someone has been a victim of crime. Federal legislation allows people to go back 2 years and looking at lost wages when someone's been trafficking. New York State allows for 6 years. So one of the successful cases that I heard about was where the Human Trafficking Coalition and the Domestic Violence brought in the Department of Labor, and they were able to get much more compensation for that victim of trafficking. And that was someone who had been trafficked by their intimate partner, and they were married, right? So many connections that I hadn't even thought about by people that are doing this work. We want to do cross-training, technical assistance. Both of these people who are responding to these issues should be part of a coordinated community response because they touch so many systems. Particular challenges are when we're working with minors, that's challenging for victims of domestic violence agencies, also challenging in terms of a response for human trafficking for domestic violence agencies, sometimes serving male victims. Our domestic violence agencies and programs have gotten much better at that. We've made a lot of progress and headway. They're required to serve victims, male victims. Language access, I think, is always a struggle for all systems, right? And fear. I think one of the things, again, there's a perception that somehow trafficking and traffickers are more dangerous than intimate partner abusers, but that is simply not the case. Oftentimes they are one and the same. I think another concern for using domestic violence services to respond to trafficking victims is, right, oftentimes we have limited resources for that already exist for victims of domestic violence. So when we open that up to people who are also victims of trafficking, right, we have limited housing, we have limited resources. Confidentiality can be an issue. Language access, and DV services really want to offer and engage, always voluntary. And oftentimes when the criminal justice system may be involved, particularly in trafficking cases, there is concern about if services are mandated or voluntary, right? We want to always, for both populations, no one should be being mandated to services or required to do anything. So we don't have a lot of time. One of the successes that I heard the most frequently when I was doing this work was that when people, particularly who were being trafficked by their intimate partner violence, that if domestic violence service providers are screening for human trafficking, that has led to so many more resources being available and has led to victims of that are both victims of trafficking and domestic violence to being able to successfully access services and support and be able to get out of that circumstance or situation and then start to get on that path towards healing and recovery. I would refer you to that Polaris website, and there's they categorize the different survivor stories, and there is one that really ties intimate partner violence and human trafficking together. And there's a lot of stories about how people were able to get to a place of healing and safety because of the collaboration between domestic violence and trafficking services. I think the growing recognition of connections between domestic violence and human trafficking will enhance survivors' ability to receive justice, immigration relief, and safety, right? And so that partnership and creating those partnerships and working together will lead to safety. This is the New York State Domestic and Sexual Violence Hotline number. It was put in the chat earlier. This will get you to all of the domestic violence resources. There's a program in every county in New York State. And calling the New York State Domestic and Sexual Violence hotline will get you to your local service providers.
And victims of human trafficking can call, text, or chat this. I worked on this hotline in COVID when we needed the resources. I had a human trafficking case on this hotline, and the woman was texting in that she was living with her trafficker, that he had left, and he never does that. She texted us, the police showed up, they were able to get her out of that home. And so again, people can reach out for those services and supports. Domestic and sexual violence, really human trafficking falls under there as well.
I know we're ending at 2:30. We are available. You can ask questions in the chat box or the Q&A. I don't see anything.
I
in
haven't
the
seen anything come up.
Q&A.
I've been watching too over here.
I know they will also put in the chat box mine and
Okay.
Stephanie's contact information. I am happy, Stephanie is happy at any point if you reach out to us via email, to respond via email, to schedule a phone call with you. Please reach out if you have any questions or there's any way that we can be helpful to you.
Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful, wonderful rest of your day. Take care, everybody.